Welcome to Creatively Christian, a podcast by Theophany Media, where we inspire, inform, educate, and empower creative Christians of all types. I'm one of your hosts, Brandon Hollingsworth. In today's episode, I talk with Christian podcaster, author, and critic Danny Anderson about how he creates hospitable places to engage with broadly different ideas. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Creatively Christian podcast. Thank you so much for being here today with us. I'm your anchor host and your sometimes podcast host, Brandon Hollingsworth, and I am super stoked to have with me a good pal of mine that I met a couple months ago, Mr. Danny Anderson. Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is it's weird to be on this end of the screen, I suppose, but I don't know that I'm interesting enough to be interviewed, but we'll see what happens, I suppose.
You are absolutely interesting enough to be interviewed. I noticed yesterday you and I were resonating kind of on that article that came out about horror and theology. So you and I were echoing on that same article. We're peas in a pod when it comes to that topic. But anyway, let me kind of introduce you to everybody who might not know about you. And I'm just going to read Danny's bio that he sent over. Hope I get all the words right. So Danny Anderson teaches English at Mount Aloysius College in Pennsylvania. He has written about film, popular culture, politics, and theology for Film Inquiry, Popular Culture and Theology, The Mantle, and Sound the Sirens, among others. He also produces and hosts the Sectarian Review podcast, and you can find him as at Danny P. Anderson on Twitter. Did I get it right?
That sounds exactly right. Yes. I review sectarians, not secretaries.
Yeah, for those, I got it wrong earlier. So, so thank you again, Danny, for coming on, and looking forward to learning more about you. So let's talk a little bit about you and kind of, what inspired you to, obviously you're not doing podcasting full time, but you're teaching English. So, jumping from English to podcasting, tell us a little bit about the inspiration there, the genesis of that.
It was, I don't know, inspiration is the right word. It's more sort of just happenstance. That's kind of the story of my life, is I just sort of trip from one thing into another. We can go. I know my biography is really not that interesting. I'm somebody who fell into what I do very late in life. I bombed out in college my first try and was away for many years and ended up going back. And then I became an English major because that was the quickest thing to finish. And then in my last semester, somebody talked me into going to grad school, and I thought, well, I didn't really know what I was going to do, so that sounds good. And then I ended up teaching English, and I was teaching. My first job out of grad school was at this little Pentecostal school in Georgia, and it called Emmanuel College. I guess it's not a secret. And at Emmanuel College works Nathan Gilmore, who is one of the co-hosts of the Christian Humanist podcast. And while I was there, one of his co-hosts had to take a basically year off of the podcast, and they asked me if I would fill in, and I did, and it turned out to be kind of fun. They liked what I did enough to ask me to do my own spinoff show. And so I left Emmanuel College in 2015. I started here, and from 2015 on, that's when the Sectarian Review became a thing. And so, yeah, it was not anything planned. I was inspired to do it because someone asked me to do it, and I found that I kind of liked it. And so that's how I ended up doing it. And one thing, I guess, to get to the spirit of your question, is I do think that it captures, like podcasting captures for me, the best part of not only my own education as a student in grad school. It's sort of like I feel like I learned more at the little restaurant outside of class, talking to interesting people. I learned as much there as I did in class, in formal settings. And I feel like podcasting is sort of an extension of that, just sort of learning for the sake of learning, not getting graded on it, thank God. Right. In my case. And that's what I try to reproduce in my class. It's not always possible. And so podcasting is kind of an extension for me of the sort of the best parts of my educational process.
Well, I mean, and you look back in history, and that's the way the great learners of the world started, our natural philosophers. And you look back to Greek and Rome, and it was just sitting around talking, sipping some vino, and just, talking about the things that make you wonder. And I really think a lot of that is becoming a lost art in our culture, especially here in the US. I don't know about other countries, but just social discourse, just having a conversation about something. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. If you don't, okay, we can agree to disagree, but let's talk about it. Let's reason through this problem. Let's kind of grapple with it in a kind of logical, progressive, move forward way. And I think it's really becoming a lost art. So, I think it does. I think it dovetails perfectly, not only with who you are, with your English background, but also who you are as a believer. Because this is something as believers we really have to grapple with in our world, is being able to, 1 Peter 3:15, give a reasoned defense for, the joy that is within you. So, I mean, it really is a part of being a believer. And so my hat's off to you, and don't downplay it. Just because you didn't know what the plan was, God knew what the plan was. So
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any maybe about it. I mean, I think he's got you right where he wants you right now, and you're killing it. So my hat's off to you, brother.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and it's a lot of fun. I have worked it into a pace that I can handle with my other responsibilities now. And I mean, that's one thing. I know you want to talk a little bit about advice for other folks, and we'll talk a little bit about understanding your own kind of limitations at some point.
Well, let's go ahead. Let's talk a little bit about that while the natural conversation is here, because the inspiration section of the show is kind of what inspired you, but also if there's a young Christian podcaster out there who's like, I really feel, me being inspired to go in this direction, give them some tidbits or some kind of helpful things that you learned.
Well, I grew up in church as well. I grew up Nazarene, sort of I don't know if that's, I kind of equate it, if you think of a spectrum between Pentecostals and Methodists, I'm sort of right in them.
Right. Yeah. I'm in North Alabama. So there's a Nazarene church like within a stone's throw of where I'm at.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So, but for the listeners who don't understand, go ahead.
This low church Wesleyan Protestant tradition, right? And so that's kind of what I grew up in. And I wouldn't, I mean, we don't need to get into my theology, I suppose, but I don't know that I particularly like locate myself there exactly now, but it's fine. And I still go to a Nazarene church regardless.
Okay.
And but I did, so growing up in a church, you notice people who are like recent converts, and then it's like, and then all of a sudden 6 months later you realize you haven't seen them for 4 months, right? And so because it was just, they sort of got burned out. And I think podcasting, any creative act, I think, can be the same, can hold the same dangers. I think that you have this pressure to kind of be impressive and be big. And so I found myself at the beginning doing, well, at the very beginning, I was doing one a month, and then I pushed it to one every other week. And then I pushed it to every week, and I did it every other week or every week for quite a long time, because I wanted to get to 100 episodes quick. And once I did that, I pulled it back to every other week again, because I realized it wasn't just it's just me by myself, right? I'm finding hosts or guests. I'm reading the books that they give me to read. And very often I'm interviewing authors. I'm doing the production, I'm doing the editing, and I'm doing the social media, like sharing and all that. And it's very time consuming.
Ton of work.
It's a ton of work.
Oh my goodness. That just makes me tired listening to it. So yeah.
And I found myself, in addition to my actual job, right? And I found myself like, trying too hard, and I felt like I was trying to be noticed too much, right? And so at some point I just kind of gave it up and realized another thing I really like to do is write, and I'm not really leaving myself any time to do that. And so for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been kind of steadily publishing things for internet magazines, basically, and some academic stuff, which nobody cares about. I don't even care about that. And so I just turned one in last night. And so, I found myself in the quest of trying to make a splash in podcasting, I was cutting myself off from other things and exhausting myself in the process. So my advice, I suppose, is don't care so much. Just do what you like, and the right people will start listening. And who cares if it's a small audience? I mean, it's the right audience, and you're not going to make money in podcasting anyway. And so, what's the big deal? And so, that's sort of my advice.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome advice. There is this element as a creative of what I call the first loves, right? You know, where you encounter something like, oh, this is amazing, I got to do this, and you kind of get a little bit infatuated. But there is a real danger, you know, of making that thing an idol,
Yeah.
right? And saying, you know, it becomes the most important thing in the world, and that's just not what we're all about as Christians. You know, that's you know, I think those Israelites had some repetitive cycle of apostasy type issues with that whole idolatry thing. And so I think that's really good advice for the young podcaster out there is yeah, you don't have to be perfect out of the gate. You don't have to have a million followers. Just do what you love, hone your craft, and do it for the glory of God, right? You know,
Yeah. And a practical thing I wish I had done, that I didn't, sadly. I do recommend starting something out. You have to get used to the sound of your own voice. And I realize I still say too much, and I'm not a trained public speaker, and I'm a very kind of fidgety person. This is why my podcast isn't on YouTube, because I want to people see me doing this all the time, right? But so I don't have a completely polished, you know, presence. I'm good enough at what I do, I think, but I'm much better now than I was at the beginning, and as bad as I am now. And so I think that my advice for folks is to record like 10 episodes that you never release. Just sort of try out the different equipment that you might use, try out different formats, try out different speaking styles, listen to yourself, make those mistakes, and live through the embarrassment of it, and the self-hatred, as I do, and get better at it. And then you'll start off at a better place at the beginning, because you'll make fewer mistakes in public. I've made many mistakes in public when I started, and so now, unfortunately, the internet never forgets. Those things are always on the internet, and I shudder when people to think that people might go back to early episodes of my show. But yeah, that's a practical thing I can offer.
That's great. That's super awesome. And again, it's about not taking yourself so seriously, you know, about trying to have a little bit of fun with it. And again, you know, taking the spotlight off of you, putting it where it needs to be. And again, it's one of the things that creatives struggle with so much, just in general, but also it seems doubly hard, you know, for a Christian creative to kind of get that in their brain and kind of get okay with it. You know, is that something you've kind of had to struggle with, and what are some things that you personally have been able to do, you know, maybe through your thought life or your prayer life, or maybe being convicted about something? What are some ways you've been able to go kind of take the spotlight off of Danny and put it on God?
I think one thing, oh gosh, that's a really good question. In terms of, I don't know how to answer that question in a in a in a in an organized way, because it's a very sort of disorganized array of thoughts I'm having about it. But let me just kind of focus on the podcast. So for one thing, it helps me to not talk too much on my podcast. Like, I will interject. I mean, you were on my show, right? And so I'll interject a reaction I have, something that you've just said makes me think of something in my life. And I'm sure that there are people who think I talk too much about myself as well. But I also find it's useful. I think of my show as sort of a form of hospitality. Okay. And so my kind of it's a driving value of mine, for probably biographical reasons. I always have a great deal of sympathy for anyone who feels left out of any kind of crowd, right? And so, one thing that I really appreciate about my show is that, to me, it's about serving people by making connections between other people, right? And so one thing that I really love about my show is when I look on social media, people who I know from this segment of my life speaking with people who I know from that segment of my life, and I know the only reason they know each other is some connection through my show, right? And so, or my social media presence, and that's been really kind of gratifying. And so that's the appeal to me, and not necessarily whether anybody thinks I'm smart. And so I think that giving that up as a goal helps me be less self-conscious when I'm talking, and that's one thing I've had to learn And one thing podcasting has frankly helped me with, and I actually use it in teaching now. I in many of my novel classes, I have students get in small groups and make little podcasts about a particular book throughout the semester, and we listen, because it's been a very useful tool for me to kind of become more confident speaking. But when I'm doing a podcast, it's more about the other person, right? And how I can introduce them to other people, and find something interesting in somebody else that other people should know about. And so it's more about kind of a celebration of other people. Although, I have to, I don't always succeed in that, but that is sort of the goal.
And that is so cool. I mean, basically what you're talking about here is you're embracing the humility of the podcast host, right? You're kind of mirroring what Christ tells us, in that you want to be a servant, right? Always. And so that's really what you're doing. You're saying, I might be the guy whose name is on the podcast, but this is really about you, right? And I'm just making a space for you to come in so that we can shine the spotlight on you and learn about you and help you out. And I think that is such a great lesson for a young podcaster to know, not only just to make their show appealing, but also just to make friends, and connections in the industry. That's the way to do it. Be a servant. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I have like I have many problems as an academic, right? I'm sort of a poor academic in many ways, I'm sure. But one of the reasons is I think what you call a dilettante. I embrace being a generalist. If someone asks me to teach a class about something that I have no expertise in, I'm perfectly happy reading the books along with the students, right? And sort of stumbling and learning in front of them. And so I'm much more of a dabbler, I suppose. And academics resist that. We sort of move. We value specialities, right? And expertise.
Very focused specialities.
Yes, exactly, right. And so that's one thing that's kind of puts me on the outs. I think I'm at the margins of a lot of communities. Academia is one of them. Okay, and so, but given that, I think the podcasting as a medium, is a perfect one for me, because I have any number of guests that come from any number of walks of life and that are doing any number of things. And I also have I have several kinds of shows. There's interview shows like I did with you about your wonderful comic book. But there's also, I have like a cadre of recurring people who come back and we'll do sort of group chats about a specific issue every now and then. Right. And so, like those, I tend to take more of an upfront role. But for me, it's all, in both cases, it's about community, right? And learning from other people about new things. And that's kind of like a drive that I have that is a disadvantage in my kind of professional career, but it's an advantage, I think, for my podcast.
Yeah, and I think again, I think this is great advice and a lot of good information for a new possible podcaster or a young Christian who's feeling like they're led to do some podcasting. I mean, you definitely got to be prepared for a podcast, but I think sometimes people can over prepare, for the podcast, where they get into such a structured kind of thought pattern about this show that if anything comes up and it's not on their list, it kind of throws them off and they don't know how to operate. And it's kind of like, no, it does not compute. That was not the next question. We must go to question C2, not C4,
Yes,
and so it kind of throws them for a loop. And so I think kind of coming prepared, but thinking of it more of, hey, this is all about you. And I just want to talk about you and help people learn about you. That is such a cool way to approach a podcast. And it's different from a lot of podcasts that I've heard. So again, hats off to you, brother.
Yeah, it makes for a very unique audience. I have a very diverse audience, ideologically at least. And I have people who kind of fall into kind of conservative Christian basic approaches to life, all the way through people who are interested in pop culture. I have people who are interested in kind of high arts. I do a series of film shows about the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. And so, and then all the way to the far left, like the secular, like Marxist left, I have people who listen to my show. And so, and it's kind of fun for me to know that they're all in the same audience, whether they know it or not. And so, yeah, it's a weird show. and you might not like every episode, but if you listen long enough, you'll probably see a connection between most of them. So.
It would be great to have call-ins with that kind of audience, to do
That
call-ins.
would be, yeah. I have, it's a really good, I've thought about that. They have that new app with, I forget what, I don't even know what it's called. Chat room? No, what's it called?
I don't know, WhatsApp, something like that.
No, there's some sort of like app where you do like live calls with people and you have
You
to be
should
invited to it.
You should totally do that. You should do one show like that with an audience like that. It begs for you to do that. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's, with a podcast, not everybody's listening at the same time, of course. So
That's
people
true.
might get to it months later. And so, who knows when people are listening to mine.
So how overt are you about your beliefs on your podcast? I mean, with a kind of diverse listener base like that, do you talk about like biblical things a lot, or is it more cultural?
Not on every show, right? And so every show, it's sort of, I don't know. I feel like I would probably disappoint a lot of people who are like more evangelical in terms of their Christianity, in terms of like sharing witness and that sort of thing, because if it's not the subject of the show, I don't go there, right? So when we're talking, we do actually get into religious stuff with Tarkovsky, since he's, even though he's working in the Soviet system, he is a very religious filmmaker himself. And so we do get into religious issues on those shows, but there are some shows where it's just not relevant, right? And so, and I don't know, this maybe goes back to my I have what I call a pathological sense of hospitality, and I feel like
I think my wife has that too.
Yes, and so I feel like I try not to bring an agenda to every situation, right? And so for an example, the show that actually just dropped today, I interviewed the author of a book that has just been published by Plow Books. It's called Pillars, How Muslim Friends Led Me to Jesus. And so it's a woman who's from Minnesota and grew up Baptist. And she and her husband her family actually have found themselves not as missionaries, but just sort of through work living in the Horn of Africa and under like Somalia and that sort of area. And so it's about sort of being a Christian minority. And so she doesn't approach her faith as she doesn't like, evangelism is not her goal, right? Amongst her neighbors, it's sort of friendship is her goal amongst her neighbors, and giving that up has allowed her to kind of create these really deep friendships with these Muslim neighbors that have in turn inspired her to think about what Muslim practitioners do with their rituals and their faith and apply it to what we do as Christians, and it helps her kind of think more deeply about her Christianity. That's very much in line with the way I approach evangelicalism on the show. I would say, if it's appropriate. So I talked a lot about faith on that show. Another show I might not, and so it's sort of
Yeah, and I don't think, I'm all about, presenting the gospel when you can and talking about Jesus when you can, but sometimes the gospel just doesn't fit into a grocery list. It's just not, it's just not there. I mean, you can try as hard as you want. And I think sometimes that's one of the issues that people have with church and with people who go to church, is that they do try and turn every conversation into something spiritual or something scriptural, when it might not be. It might we're just talking about the grocery list, or we're just, talking about, the weather or whatever. We don't have to say, oh, and the Lord controls the weather, at some point it can seem a little bit forced. And so, I think that lends itself to just creating that sense of hospitality and friendship that you're talking about.
Yeah. And the danger, I think, in doing that as just sort of a practice, right? Wherever I'm going to find a way to wedge this in, is that you might, you might, and I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about this hypothetical you. For you might be approaching this with good intentions. I don't want them to go to hell, right?
Sure.
I am saving their soul. But if you step back, you're actually sort of using them, right? You're sort of, it's almost an act of bullying in some level, right? And you're treating them more as an object than a person, just as sort of an object I need to bounce my faith off of, so that I can make it's a form of virtue signaling for for Christians, right? I think. And so I think that there's a real danger in getting in the way of a relationship that's probably more fruitful and probably what we're more likely called to do anyway than drag somebody into the church doors in some ways, right? And so I think that there is a place. I realize this is a chancy statement. Shame is not something that's valued in culture. I do think that shame is a wonderful thing. in certain, I do think there's a place for shame and for that kind of thing. But I don't think that that's the first thing I want to go to.
No, absolutely not. You want to, I mean, you know, you don't go and get advice from a random stranger. You know, if you're like, hey, which carburetor am I going to put on my car? Or, you know, what's the best hedge trimmer? You don't just go ask a random person. You're going to ask somebody that you know and you trust. And so I think I would imagine that, you know, for issues that revolve around my eternal soul, I'm probably going to treat that a little bit more, you know, importantly than I would hedge trimmers. So I'm going to go to a source that I trust, and some random guy sitting next to me, you know, is probably not the guy I'm going to go to first. Yeah. I might listen to him, but he's probably not my go-to.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And also I think my show kind of like, we're part of the Christian Humanist Radio Network. And so there's lots of shows. There's the flagship, we call it, Christian Humanist podcast, the Christian Humanist Profiles, where they interview authors about faith-based books and that sort of thing, philosophical books and that sort of thing. Christian Feminist podcast, Book of Nature, which is a bunch of Christian scientists. My wife has a show about Christian environmentalism called Restoration on that network. And so the general philosophy of the Christian Humanist Radio Network is that your Christianity isn't just confined to theology, right? Your Christianity, your Christian walk is a celebration of everything humans do well. That's kind of the slogan of the show, right? And so looking at the work of an atheist filmmaker, or looking at the work of whatever else, that's a form of worship. You know what I mean? Because you're feeding your mind, which is something that God gave us, and you're feeding your view of the world. You're making your empathetic impulse bigger. You're able to then engage the world more fully and more richly. And so I feel like you don't always have to have a 3-point sermon with clear takeaways for your faith, right? And my show certainly does not do that. And in fact, I am sure that many of my episodes would offend very kind of dogmatic, like conservative sorts of Christian approaches, just as I'm sure other shows will offend many of my secular listeners, right? And so, but I think my regular listeners are willing to be offended where it's appropriate, and they know that it's out of love.
That should be your slogan: offending where appropriate.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, and that's. I mean, I just wrote a review of your comic, and I actually opened it with a quote from Franz Kafka, who's one of my favorite writers. And
the Metamorphosis,
yes, exactly. And he has this sort of theory of art, and we should only read books that stab us and wound us, right? And a book should be something to break up the frozen sea inside of us, right? And I think that, that confrontation with something that isn't comfortable is a good thing, right? And so I think that that's and in fact, it's a holy thing for me. And so I think that my show is willing to kind of perhaps be sacrilegious at times in order to achieve holy goals. And so I know there's a paradox built in there, and I'm willing to accept criticism for it, but that's sort of what works.
Well, and it kind of goes back to the thing we were talking about at the start of the show, with that being able to have that social discourse where you and I might disagree on these things, but we can still talk about them in a meaningful way. You know, we might not come to the same resolution, but we can talk about and discuss them. And in doing so, I learn more about you, you learn more about me. We might learn more about the topic at hand, and hopefully we walk away with a couple of new wrinkles in our brain. And I think that's never a bad thing. It's when you kind of have this dogmatic belief in something without examining it, I think, is the most dangerous thing, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's sort of my, I mean, I won't bore you with like academic ponderings about that kind of thing, but that is a sort of a central question, is like being honest with yourself and getting knocked out of your comfort zone so that you can sort of observe yourself from a distance a little bit. You ever see the movie Doctor Strange? Where he goes off and out of his body. I feel like, I mean, I don't know if I believe in that kind of like possibility, but I mean,
Right.
but I think that it's, as a metaphor, that's a really interesting moment. And that's when he sees the truth of his life, is when he's kicked out of his body and he can sort of look at himself, right?
At the
And I
bigger
feel like,
picture, yeah.
yes, a confrontation with ideas and art should accomplish that. That's not to say you shouldn't enjoy. I mean, I just talked about Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
I enjoy popular entertainment too, right? But you should also learn to appreciate art that that does challenge you.
Yeah, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. So let's jump into the kind of education portion of the show, and let's talk a little bit about, was there anything specifically in Danny's past that you were like, you kind of built on the rock of this educational nugget that led you into your podcasting and kind of what you're doing now? Obviously, you're basing a lot of this on your knowledge, but is there a rock that you're building on?
That's a really good question. So I don't come from a family of academics or professionals. My family is all from West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
They, about half my family stayed and about half moved to Cleveland. My parents happened to be among the half that moved to Cleveland, and that's where I was born. And so I feel like I always had this sense of displacement. I guess this goes back to this sense of hospitality. I always kind of felt like I was a Clevelander, but I was the son of hillbillies from West Virginia, so I wasn't quite a Clevelander, right? And then we kept moving at certain times around the area of Northeast Ohio, and so I never quite felt like I was from anywhere, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, and that growing up as a Browns fan as well gives you an appreciation for the underdog, right, in life. And so, I think that just sort of accustomed me, or put me in the habit, I suppose, of living at the edges of a community. So I'm a part of the Christian community, but I'm not like a perfectly respected member at the center of it, right? And so I'm a part of particular political communities, right? But I don't buy everything, and so I'm kind of at the edges of that. Academia, I've already talked about, and so that it's more of like a perspective, I think, that that's sort of why I'm able to kind of cover the variety of topics that I can cover, right? And my job is sort of because I'm at the edge of pop culture and theology, or if I'm at the edge of horror fandom and religion, right? I can bridge a gap there and try to convince these two communities they have something in common, right? And so I feel like that perspective, it's not so much a piece of knowledge that I had or something that I learned, but it's just sort of a position in the world that I got used to, right? And so and now I'm at the point where, like, is it not Karl Marx, Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx has the line, like, I would never want to belong to a club that would have someone like me as a member, right?
Exactly.
And so I feel like a danger I have is this resistance to kind of joining at this point, and maybe I'm a little obstinate about it on some level as an ethic, right? And so
Right.
I have to push against that a little bit and realize that I do live in a place and I need to be a participating member of that community. But yeah, so that's sort of less of a piece of knowledge than more of an experience, I suppose.
Well, that's super cool. And I'm not a joiner either. And I am a reflexive, as soon as you tell me to do something, I'm gonna do the opposite of that. So I'm just kind of that
Yes.
kind of guy as well. But I think it's super encouraging the fact that you've kind of built a following and a successful podcast on the fact that you don't belong any place, that you kind of are this kind of gypsy-like vagabond that kind of, journeys across the fringe edges of all these different little topics. And in doing so, you've kind of created your own little tribe, or you've identified tribes that you can resonate with. And I think, for an aspiring podcast host out there, I think that's so encouraging. I think that's just like, yeah, I don't have to have this schooled learning, or I don't have to have this, certificate where I've gone and got this podcasting degree. I can just kind of find my tribe and talk to them and listen to them and help empower them. That's really, really, really nifty.
Yeah, I have, for someone who's a teacher, I have probably unorthodox ideas about education, because I think it is both liberating and imprisoning. Okay. And so I always do this little exercise in class. And so I have them read the story. Everyone should read the story, and I'm shamelessly going to promote it. It's a little 5-page short story that you will love if you listen to it. It's called A Summer's Reading by Bernard Malamud, is his name. And it's a very famous old short story. I've probably read it 500 times. I love this story. And so, but it's basically a basic story about this kid on the margins of society who jumps into books and finds, and it's liberation, right? For him at the end of the story, it's liberation. He finds freedom in education, okay? And then I juxtapose that with a Kafka story called Report for an Academy, which is about this ape who is kidnapped from the Gold Coast, I think, and brought to Europe to be in a zoo. But while he's on the boat, he realizes if he imitates the people on the boat, then they like him, and they give him a little bit more privileges, right? And so he takes this ethos all the way to learning to speak on stage. And so he's on Ape performing in front of these folks, and telling him and just using big words and impressing them all. And he never thinks that it's freedom. He explicitly talks about it not being freedom. It's basically just a little bigger, more comfortable cage. Like, the free version of me ended when you brought me over here. Okay.
Right.
So education for him is a prison, right? And that is, I maintain that is true. You can become such an expert, you can become such a respected member of a particular community that what you've done is just build walls between yourself and anything else, and you can't see beyond that anymore. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I feel like that's always in the back of my head when I'm teaching, is that I'm empowering them on some level, but I'm also at the same time limiting the way they can see the world. Right. And I feel a little bit of conflict about this. And so, yeah, I don't know, something you said brought that to mind. I feel like that was relevant to what we were talking about.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because again, I think it's something that we've got, it goes back to the conversation we we're having earlier about, exposing ourselves to art that challenges us, right? We've got to, we're building these walls of knowledge, but we got to make sure we poke little breathing holes, or maybe little holes that we can stick our telescopes through so we can see beyond the walls of our knowledge and peer out into the unknown and examine that unknown, because that's where that future knowledge is going to come from. So it's a really, really beautiful, beautiful example of that. I really like that a lot.
And I have that conversation with my students. I actually wrote a review of an old immigrant novel by this woman named Anzia Jezierska, and I use that sort of comparison at the beginning to talk about the version of education we see in that novel. And so this is it's sort of an obsession of mine, is this observing the ways in which the things we conceive of as freedom are actually sorts of little prisons, right? If we're not careful, right? And in fact, they are both freedom and prison. If I'm okay with living in paradox.
You need that on a shirt, living in paradox. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely. And I would love it if you could maybe send over some links to those two stories, or if there's somewhere online that we can link to those and put them in the show notes. Cause I know, being a Kafka fan, I haven't read that particular story, and now I really want to read it. And the other story sounds intriguing as well. So I'd love it to pass that on to our audience too. So if you,
I always, I have to cry in front of class when I read A Summer's Reading. It's just a very beautiful story, and I always have to pause at a certain moment, because I'll start like, I have been known to cry in class, and I'm that annoying English professor. And so, but yes, that is one of my favorites. So those are two of my favorites, actually.
There's nothing wrong with that, Danny. Nothing wrong with that at all. All right, so let's jump into the empowerment section of the podcast, and really a lot of the stuff that you've already been talking about is really pretty empowering as well. But was there something at some point in your journey that really just kind of put the spurs to Danny and said, hey, I've never done this podcasting stuff before, but I really want to do it because of X, or because of this thing that happened? Was there a moment in time? Was there a bit of
I don't want to like limit it to just podcasting, because I feel like the writing I do and the podcasting and my teaching are all sort of part of a whole.
Sure.
For me, it's all sort of just variations on an approach to life that I have. Right. It's sort of an engagement with other people through these different media. Right.
All right.
And so I write a lot of film reviews, and I really hate starred reviews of movies, like 4 and 3 and 2 stars. Like, you don't walk into an art museum and say, oh, that statue is 2.5 stars, right? I don't understand. Yeah, a movie has flaws like everything, and the flaws are what make it interesting. So the kind of stuff I write are never like thumbs up or thumbs down. And so I just find that kind of film Twitter nonsense annoying. And so I really hate that. So whenever, so it, for me, I've already kind of lived this. I'm very comfortable knowing that I'm a total nerd, and people are going to think that I get too excited about things and think I'm a dork because of that. And I really don't care. I think those people are kind of boring. And so I don't really care what they think. Right. And so, yes, think of me whatever you like. Right. That's always, ever since I've been a little kid, that's sort of my little approach to life, if I haven't stated it right. So I've always been okay being a jerk, right? Not a mean jerk, but like a fool, right? And so I recently just watched Ethan Hawke do a little like a TED Talk kind of thing that he recorded himself, like in a restaurant or something. It's really interesting. He's like in a restaurant himself, and it was a really inspirational talk, right? And it really captures the spirit of and it gave me kind of language to describe the way I've always approached these things. Is, to be creative is to be kind of joyful, right? And a little kid, when he says this in the video, when they're playing with something, they're not worried about perfection. They're just having fun in the sandbox, right? And I feel like giving yourself, and he says, giving yourself permission to be the fool, to fail, to make something and it's bad. You know what I mean? Like that to me is very liberating, because ultimately, if someone, and he says this, critics are usually wrong. Like, you know what I mean? When The Shining came out, everyone hated that movie. And now we realize what idiots they were for hating that movie, right? And so whatever the zeitgeist says about something in the moment, who cares? Because probably someone will reevaluate that later, right? But also, like, nobody's gonna remember anyway. This podcast, I mean, like at some point, how many things have been created in the history of mankind?
Sure.
And nobody even remembers that anybody did it. Did that made it not worth doing for the person who did it? No, I mean, they did it and it was meaningful to them. And so who cares if it's perfect? No one's going to remember anyway. 5 billion years from now, the sun's going to explode and no one will ever know human beings existed at all. So who cares, right? And so like this is just, be free to screw up in public is what my point is, right? And so it's a big step. Rejection is a big thing. I've written essays and sent them to places and they said no, and it's depressing and it's kind of angering, right, in the moment, but you move on and find someone who's going to say yes. And so and those are the people you'll enjoy being with anyway. And so whatever you kind of create, just sort of like live with the fact that it's going to suck, and that doesn't make it bad. Okay. That's part of what makes it interesting and good. Okay. And so that's sort of my my little motto of life. Just take it or leave it is sort of what I would say to the critics out there. Right. And in this, I'm aiming this at myself. I've had this little novel in my head for like 5 years now, and I've got little outlines all over the place for it. And I've never about a year ago, I sat down and chunked out 3,000 words of it. And then I shuttered away and set it aside. And I got busy too. I had a crazy year, as everyone did. But I had, in addition to COVID, other things going on in my life with parental health issues and that sort of thing. So I was distracted. But I've just decided I'm going to write a crappy novel, and probably no one will ever read it, but I don't care. I got to get it out. And so like, this is,
I'll read it.
So yeah, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more, Danny. I mean, literally, probably one of the most influential things that has ever happened in my life, and that has affected me more than almost anything other than my salvation, was in the 10th grade. I finally decided that I didn't care what anybody thought anymore. I was just going to be me, and I was just going to enjoy being me and do what I wanted to do, and that has been so freeing. And you're exactly right when it comes to creation, that failure is a critical part of the process. It is, everyone fails when they create something. No one creates it perfect the first time, whether it's engineering or whether it's art. I mean, it's never done right the first time. And so the sooner you embrace that and learn to really lean into it and kind of expect the feedback that you're going to get whether it's from your editor or from your, close beta group or your fans or from the public or whoever you expose that work to initially. As soon as you learn to lean into that and expect it and get ready for it and almost anticipate it, that's when you really, in my mind, start leveling up as a creative. You start then going, okay, yeah, they told me this, that, and the other, and this and that, but the other, that's really important. And so now I've got to incorporate that into my work. And so
Yeah.
that's spot on.
And for me, I mean, I think there's a way in which that works well with sort of Christian outlooks on life, this idea of like faith and whatnot. There's also, I have to admit, I mean, one of my premises of life is you have to be honest with yourself, right? And this sort of self-reflection, right? So inside of that is clearly like an aggression, right? There's clearly an anger in there as well, right? And so that's one thing that's a little challenging, is that to be creative is to sort of push the boundaries of propriety, right? And so
absolutely.
just the act of creating something. I'm going to throw out an English person name, but great writer Cynthia Ozick is her name. She's a very observant Jewish writer, and she's very elderly now, but still doing amazing work. But she, throughout her life, wrote amazing art, like amazing novels, incredible criticism, and she wrestled with the idea of just creating something is idolatry. It is competing with God's imagination on some level, and there's a boldness to that that you have to accept, that you are sort of challenged. I mean, this is a very kind of particular conservative Jewish perspective on art and engraven images and that sort of thing. But you have to own the fact that when you create anything, I'm trying to not use vulgar language. It's cojones, right?
You're kind of thumbing your nose at God. It's like, oh no, you didn't do it right. I'm going to do it. Watch me.
It is. You're identifying something that's lacking in the world, right?
Wow,
and so
that is such a cool perspective.
and so balancing that kind of with a reverence to God is the trick, right? And Ozick's fiction does that, right? And that's what's so great about what she does, is that it understands the aggression of creativity, but also understands the necessity of it, right? And so you have this kind of these two polar opposites, it's like magnets that will never put their own polars, the wrong, whatever the science
polarity
is there. The polarity, they'll never come together, but they kind of hold each other in balance, right? And so it's a tension that is inescapable, and you have to kind of just own it and realize that the act of creating is challenging enough. Don't worry so much about what you're creating, right? At the beginning, at least. At some point, that comes into play. There are works of art that should not have been created, I guess.
We were talking about getting new wrinkles on your brain earlier. I'm getting new wrinkles on my brain right now. I can definitely see. So folks, that's just a tip. That's just kind of a little bit of, sample of what you'll find on Danny's podcast. So definitely be tuning in. So tell us, Danny, where folks can find you. And then is there anything new or special that you got working on that may be coming out soon?
So you can find me. I have, what do I have? A Twitter, at Danny P. Anderson is my Twitter, and it's probably easiest to find me. The show does have a Twitter too. I'm really bad at keeping that up. I used to, like I said, I've kind of given up trying to be noticed on that kind of thing. But it does have, I do share things. I share the show basically on it, at Sectarian Review on Twitter. There's also an email it's at sectarianreview@gmail.com. There's a website, like if you just Google Sectarian Review, you'll find my website, sectarianreviewpodcast.com. So you'll find that kind of stuff there. I don't really have my writing. I have some of my writing. I stopped updating the website for it. I don't have it like collected anywhere, but I don't know. If you're interested, just send me an email and I'll send you a link to it. But yeah, so that's how to contact me. I just got something published last week in Pop Matters, which was kind of a nice surprise. I wrote this. I'm interested in this 19th century British Victorian poet and critic named Matthew Arnold. He's a major influence on the way I think about things, and I'm the last person in the world who cares about him. And so if you ever read the poem Dover Beach, that's his. And so, but I'm interested in his criticism as well. But I used some of his ideas about poetry and like the proper subject of poetry to make a defense of Zack Snyder's Justice League. And so I wrote this and I thought, I am literally the only person who will care about this essay. No, anybody who cares about Matthew Arnold doesn't care about Justice League. Anybody who cares about Justice League doesn't care about Matthew Arnold. And so I'm both the only person who could have written this and the only person who will read this. And yet Pop Matters like published that. So you could find that on their website.
What validation, what validation. That's amazing.
I'm very proud of that, actually.
You should be.
I feel like I slipped one under the system there. So
that's amazing. And you're confronting the very fears that you were talking about earlier about, 5,000 years, nobody will remember any of this stuff. And you're like, no,
anyway, right?
No, I'm putting the stake in the ground. That's great. That's
exactly.
Great. Well, Danny, I mean, this has been just a blast. I mean, I had people whispering in my ear saying, this is going to be a great interview, Brandon, get ready. And they were not lying. This has been an amazing journey and such a blast. And I knew after my interview with you or your interview with me when I came on your show that you were a guy I wanted to get to know more. And I'm so blessed to have that opportunity today. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Gosh, I'm really humbled that I'm usually, like I said, I feel like I'm the person who has nothing to say. So I ask other people's opinions. And so I'm very excited and to be here and grateful for the opportunity. So
well,
thank you,
obviously you've proven yourself wrong today. So you gotta be honest. You got a lot to say. So maybe we'll have you on again sometime. So I think
anytime, please let me know.
Great. Well, let me pray for us. I always like to pray when I'm closing out our show. So I'll pray us out and then we'll both say goodbye. Does that sound good?
Yep.
All right. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this beautiful day that you've made. We thank you for the snow at Danny's house and for the sun at my house. We thank you so much for blessing us, Father, and for making us healthy, making our minds and bodies work. For giving us the ability to be creative, and we don't mean to be aggressive with that, Father. And so we just pray that we will be creative in the right spirit. I thank you so much for all the insights that Danny has given us and our listeners and our viewers today. I pray that there's something in this podcast, Father, that will help someone understand their role in your kingdom more, and that they will be able to grapple with the challenges that are presented to them in this world as creatives and as Christians, and they will be able to rise to that challenge. I pray your blessings on Danny, on his podcast, on his teaching, on his family, Father. If it be your will, keep them safe. And I pray that we get to hang out again soon. And thank you so much for allowing me to get to know a brother in Christ here on this side of eternity a little bit better. And I'm looking forward to hanging out with him in eternity future. And so we thank you so much, Father, for your grace and your mercy and for your love and for your forgiveness and for your son, Jesus, who shed blood, allowed us to have a right relationship with you. Pray for all of our listeners and all our watchers. And I pray for the platform that Theophany Media and Creatively Christian provide. We give it all to you, Father. In your son's name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, my brother. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody, be sure and check out Danny. We're going to post all his links in the show notes, and he's going to send over all those cool stories. And again, if you want to get a hold of him, he accepts emails. So just be sure and attach the $10 bill to each email when you send it to him.
Yeah, honestly, if you just look me up on my college website, Mount Aloysius College, just find me in the department. You can send me an email there too. Like I say that because no one will take me up on this, so it really doesn't matter. So
awesome. Thanks so much, Danny, for being on the show today. You be blessed, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Same thing. Thanks.
All right, brother. Thanks so much for listening today. To find out more about this episode and the resources that Danny mentioned, be sure and check out our show notes over at theophanymedia.com/Danny. Creatively Christian is a product of Theophany Media. You can find out more at theophanymedia.com. This show is hosted by Brandon Hollingsworth, Andrea Sandifer, Bill Brooks, and Lynn Baber. Our logo is by Bill Brooks. Our music is by Bill Brooks and Andrea Sandifer. To join our paid membership, the Creatively Christian Club, which includes exclusive content, networking events, and masterminds with expert creatives, just go to club.theophanymedia.com. Have a blessed day and keep on creating for our Lord.